Hi everyone, now we are going to have a look at some string recursion tracing. So I have this method here called reverse, which takes in a string parameter and then it should output the reverse of that string. We're going to trace that to see how it operates. So we know when we run this code, what we run is the main method. So main is the initial scope that we're in, and main is put on top of the call stack, because that's where we are. So let's trace through that. So line 3 in main says that we're creating a string called stressed, which I have here. And then line 4 says string rev, representing reverse, is equal to the output or the return of this function call, which is this one here. So the reverse of stressed. So now at this point, we are going into the scope of this method here, reverse stressed, and we need to work out what it returns in order to continue on with our main method. So we're in this scope here, which means we've put this method onto the call stack, and we will continue tracing. So S is what is representing our parameter. So our first check is if the string is null or if its length is less than 2. So if we get a length is 1 or 0, then we just return the string. But that's not the case here, so we'll continue on. So I've got first is equal to the character at index 0. So the character at index 0 in my string is this S. So I've got first is equal to S. And then I've got on line 13, I've got a string called rest, which is a substring starting at index 1 of S. So index 1 is the letter T, so I've got a substring from this point onwards, and that's represented here. And then my next line, line 14, says I have a string called revrest, and that is equal to the output or the return of this function here. So now we're starting to recurse. So we need to work out what this function here returns in order to continue on with the code within this function. So that means that we're entering the next scope, which is reverse TRESSED. So now we're back on line 9. We're doing our null check, which we don't need to worry about. So we've got line 12, which says character first is equal to the character at 0. Character at 0 is T. Then we've got a substring starting at index 1, which is the R onwards, this one here. And then I've got revrest on line 14 is equal to the reverse of rest. So we need to work out what this returns here. So that gets put on top of our call stack. And we jump into this scope. So we'll go back into that function again. So we're back on line 9. It's not null, the length is not less than 2, so we continue on. So line 12, we've got first is equal to the character at 0, so that is the letter R. Then I've got rest is a substring starting at index 1, ESSED. And then line 14 says revrest is equal to reverse of rest, the reverse of ESSED. So we've got another function call, so that gets put on top of the call stack, and we jump into this scope here. So this will continue on for a while, where we continue to grab the first character from our string and then separate it from the rest of the string, the substring starting at 1. And then we call our reverse method and assign our variable revrest the output of that reverse method with that substring starting at index 1. So that will continue on until we get a string whose length is less than 2. So if I continue tracing, we'll continue down. So every time I've got one less, until we get to this scope down the bottom. So as we would have gone, each of those methods will be put on top of the call stack. So now at the very, very top of our call stack, we have this method here, reverse of the string D. and the length of that string is less than 2, so that means that we're returning S. So we finally have our base case, so we're finally returning something, so that means that we can start making our way back to our main method, popping our functions off the stack and returning our values back to where they were called. So reverse D, this function was called here, so we need to return that value back to where it was called. So this value, S, which is the string, which is the string D, so the string D is being returned back to that function call. So I can replace that here. And we know that when we return, we're exiting from that function. So that's being popped off the stack, and now we resume the previous method that we were in from what line we were in before we jumped to the new function. So that was line 14. So we were here, we're on line 14 when we said, okay, I need to find out what reverse rest is. Now we know what it is, it's D, so we can continue on with our code. So we've got line 15 says result is equal to rev rest plus first. So we've got rev rest is D, first is E, so now we've got DE, and that's what we're returning. We're returning result, which is DE. So we're returning something, that means that we're exiting our function, which means we are returning that back to the function call. And when we return, we're taking this off the call stack and we've gone back to where that function was called. And we continue on like this. So we were on line 14, now we know what rev rest is. So now we've got result is equal to rev rest plus first, so DES. And that's what we're returning result. So this is being returned back to where the function was called. And because we're returning, we're exiting from this function, and so on. So this continues on. So now I've got result is DES, that's being returned back to our function call. We're exiting this function, so that's being popped off the stack. Again, we're in this scope now. Result is equal to rev rest plus first. And result is what's being returned, so we're returning it back to the function call, turning it back to that previous method on the call stack, and we're exiting this function, removing it from our call stack. Continue, got result is rev rest plus first, and that's what's being returned. So we're returning it back here. And then we're exiting this method. So we're getting closer and closer to our main method. We've got result is equal to rev rest plus first, and that is being returned back to our function call. We're exiting this function. It's being taken off the call stack. And I keep collecting some letters as I go. Oh, there we go. So we're getting closer and closer. So we're back into the scope of our first function call. So now we can return something back to main So we've got result is equal to rev_rest plus first, which is s, and we're returning result back to the function call, which is up here. So now I'm returning that back to the main method. So I'm returning desserts. We're exiting this function. It's taken off our stack. Now we're in our main method. We're back on line 4, so we can continue on. We know rev is equal to desserts because we've traced it all the way down and all the way back up. And we just continue on with our code. So now we're on line 5, which is just printing out rev, which will just be desserts. So that's how you would trace it visually. And now we'll have a look at how to do that using the debugger inside Eclipse. So I've got a breakpoint on line 6, which is where my first function call is. I'm going to run it in debug mode. So I'm in the main scope. When I step into this one, I'll go into the scope of this function call. And that's been put on top of the stack. Let's step over that. Oops. So that was just, it jumped to the string class because I've got the char at method. So if you want to avoid going through all of that, you want to do step over. I'm going to step over that. I'm going to step over substring, but I'm not going to step over this because this is our function call that we've created, so we want to keep track of that. So I'm going to step into that. So now I'm in this scope here, added that to the stack. I'm going to step over, step into this one. Now that's on the stack. Got our variables. Another recursive function call, that's on the stack. Our next scope. Now our string is SED, so we're getting closer. So now we've got this recursive function call here. We've got reverse and we're passing in rest, and rest is currently the string D. So this should be our last recursive call. So if we step into this, I've got if s is equal to null. No. Is the length less than 2? Yes, which means we're returning s. So finally we've got all of these recursive calls here. Once we start returning, we're going to be taking them off the stack and working our way back to our main method here. So step over that one, we're returning s, so this should pop that first one off the stack and we should jump back down to line 16 of the previous function scope. So I step into here. So now I'm continuing where I left off. So now I've got a value for rev_rest, which is D. Result is rev_rest plus first. Oh, I should have stepped over that. That's okay. Again. Step over again. So result is equal to DE, which is rev_rest plus first. And again, when I take this step here, I'm returning result and I'm returning it to the previous function, which is line 16 here, which means this is going to pop off the stack. There we go. So now we can keep tracing, keep making our way through the rest of our methods for each of our functions here until we're at our initial function call here. And when we return result, we'll be returning it back to our main method on line 6. So when I step here, the value of result, which is desserts, will go back to line 6. When I run that, I've got rev is equal to desserts. When I print it out, I should get desserts. Great. And there we go, we've got desserts.